30 minutes, but I'll try and be keep it brief, and also I'll try not to struggle saying archipelagic too often, so forgive me for that. So what I'm going to talk about this evening then is a project that grew out of the one that Gad mentioned on the West India regiments. I'm not a military historian, but I've actually started to realize that there is a lot of value in, I think, some of the records and sources associated with the military, which I think we tended to overlook. And the other thing I've often said is that military history is too important to be left to military historians, and that's something that I believe very strongly. So I'm going to sort of talk about the new project that I've begun just over a year ago. I'm hoping to get a lot of it done next year when I'm on leave, and then I'll give you a taste of the kind of work I'm doing. Okay, so Brigadier General John Moore was part of a large British expeditionary force of more than 25,000 soldiers that began to arrive in the Caribbean in spring of 1796. It was commanded by Ralph Abercrombie, and his orders were to restore British control of St. Lucia, to suppress
David,
insurrection.
do you want to put the PowerPoint on?
Did you not see it?
Not at the moment.
Oh, sorry. I thought Steve said I could see it. Sorry, apologies.
We did, but then it disappeared, I think.
Oh, right. That's weird.
Maybe you might have accidentally pressed stop share.
There you go.
It's
fine. Yeah,
right.
It's there.
You can see that? Okay, so
yeah.
Abercrombie. So Abercrombie expedition, basically their orders are to restore British control of St. Lucia, put down the Fedon Rebellion in Grenada, end the Anglo-Garifuna War in St. Vincent, and then if possible go on to capture Guadeloupe. And after taking part in the capture of St. Lucia, John Moore, shown here, is left in charge as the British military governor, as the rest of the British Expeditionary Force move on to their next objectives. And Moore's given the job of restoring tranquility to St. Lucia, which is, in other words, we mean white supremacism, racial slavery, the restoration of the plantation system, all under British rule. Yet only a month into his appointment, he's in despair. And he writes in his journal, which he keeps, upon the whole, since I've been in the West Indies, I have observed so little system, such neglect in the higher orders, and such relaxation in the lower, neither zeal nor spirit anywhere, that I am convinced that the sooner we make peace, the better. Against the spirit and enterprise of the Republic, the French Republic, we have no chance. Now, written amidst the ongoing war between Britain and the French Republic, Moore's comments point to the difficulties associated with campaigning and counterinsurgency in the late 18th and early 19th century Caribbean, but also how he understood the contest between forces of revolution and counter-revolution as an emotional as well as a political and a military struggle. Lacking zeal, Moore feared the British and their French royalist allies could not hope to prevail against the spirit and enterprise of the mainly African-descended revolutionaries that they faced. So this paper is part of a wider research project that explores how British military personnel experienced, understood, and represented their counter-revolutionary activities in the Caribbean in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The outbreak of war with France saw Britain dispatch large numbers of troops, sailors, and Royal Navy vessels to capture French colonies, disrupt French trade, blunt the effectiveness of the French Navy, all, of course, whilst attempting to forestall the influence of revolutionary sentiment, in other words, to maintain the status quo. Indeed, between 1793 and 1798, the British government sent over 60,000 soldiers in addition to the 6,000 already there. And this is kind of part of a pattern of how the British fight the French in the Caribbean. However, the disruption and radicalization associated with the French Atlantic revolutions transformed the nature of the conflict during the 1790s, and British forces in both Saint-Domingue and across the Eastern Caribbean found themselves opposed by large sections of local populations, many, of course, of African descent, many formerly enslaved, seeking liberty and equality. In this context, they faced unfamiliar forms of fighting against highly motivated enemies they sought to dismiss as mere brigands, all while facing the debilitating effects of disease. And what the project tries to do is to look at how the British personnel involved, from the commanding officers, people like Charles Grey or John Moore, all the way down to literate non-commissioned officers, tried to and often failed to understand and comprehend with the political, social, cultural, as well as the military situation they faced. And I've been collecting private correspondence, published journals, memoirs, military dispatches, newspapers, etc. And in sort of theoretical terms, the project is informed by history of emotions, mobility studies, environmental history, history of ideas, as well as the so-called new military history. Now, I'm not going to talk about that in those kind of subdisciplinary areas, but instead, I want to talk about some of the kind of concepts that animate the project, which hopefully will allow people to see the kind of the bigger picture and the bigger contributions I'm seeking to make. So first of all, this idea of campaigning and counterinsurgency in the Creole Archipelago, of course, is borrowed from Tessa Murphy's prize-winning book of the same title. For those of you who don't know, Murphy uses this to describe a hybrid community of trafficked enslaved Africans, indigenous Kalinagos, European settler colonists, all connected across a watery geography encompassing sea and land, which developed outside and often sought to contest official European imperial control in the 17th and early 18th centuries. And the aftermath of the French Revolution, and indeed the outbreak of resistance to slavery and conflict between royalists and republicans in the French Caribbean, provides fresh opportunities for this hybrid community to contest their place in the region, particularly in those colonies under British rule. Now, although Tessa's focus is on the southern Windward Islands, her arguments have wider purchase, and this very much dovetails with the work of Gunvar Simmerson, Rasmus Christiansen, and other colleagues at the University of Copenhagen who are working in the same sea project, which if people don't know, I'd highly recommend. And this has sought to undertake a systematic investigation of the combined history of the Lesser Antilles from the 1650s to the 1850s, trying to understand how inter-island connections transformed separate islands into a common world of slavery and freedom. Now, when I speak to non-Caribbean specialists, they often presume that this kind of interconnected approach to the Caribbean would be fairly standard. But I think we, as many of us are Caribbeanists here, probably have to recognize that although the rise of global, Atlantic, interconnected history has certainly pushed things in that direction, there has been a tendency to privilege particular parts of the region, British Jamaica, French Saint-Domingue, the later Spanish Cuba, sometimes under the guise of regional or comparative approaches. Moreover, while it might seem fairly obvious that we're focusing on the revolutionary period, we'd want to focus on Saint-Domingue, Paul Friedland is right, I think, to argue that, quote, and obviously, you'll notice the mistake here, every island is not Haiti. And indeed, he urges us to attend to the insurrections and insurgencies of the Eastern Caribbean. While some local histories have tended to portray the events in St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Grenada as enslaved insurrections, or perhaps as race wars, Friedland's argument is actually that the rebels of the Windward Islands did not see themselves as fighting in separate local rebellions, but rather imagined themselves to be participating in the French Revolution, which they understood as a worldwide revolution to establish a universal republic in support of rights for all people, regardless of race or nationality. Or, to put it more succinctly, the rebels of the Caribbean, black, white, and of mixed race, those who made up Murphy's hybrid community, in other words, saw themselves as part of the revolution, fighting for a cause they embraced as their own. And I was just discussing with Steve Gadd and Kate just before we started the seminar. Friedland, who's not a Caribbean specialist, has got a new book coming out in fall, where he's going to make this argument. And I think that's going to be an interesting one for us as Caribbean specialists to think about. And indeed, these groups would continue to defend this revolutionary ideal against the French in Saint-Domingue, of course, but also in Guadeloupe. Now, for my purposes, the significance of the work of Murphy, Simmerson, Friedland, and others is that it helps to define the interconnected world that the British military entered in the 1790s and which they tried to come to terms with. Many of their adversaries were drawn from its mobile hybrid community, and the British performed violent actions to shatter its watery solidarities. Moreover, British military campaigning and counterinsurgency, as well as the actions of British colonial authorities, such as the declaration of martial law, restrictions placed on the movement of refugees, and the eventual forced exile of social groups deemed resistant to the expansion of the British plantation frontier, I'm thinking of the Garifuna and, of course, some of the Maroons in Jamaica, can be understood in terms of waging a war on the Creole Archipelago, which would eventually bring its demise by the end of the 18th century. By focusing on the Caribbean in this kind of way, the project seeks to engage with wider perspectives on the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And I particularly have Mecca Rebsay's Napoleonic Wars is a really, really great book from a few years ago, which anyone who's interested in this period, I would urge you to look at. But I'm also thinking of David Bell's work on where he argues that the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars were the first total war, characterized by, he argues, the mobilization of whole populations, ill-defined objectives, and the emergence of exterminatory logics. And Bell and others who followed him focus almost entirely on events in Europe. They talk about the Counter-Insurgency in the Vendée, the struggles in Calabria, and of course the Peninsular War especially. But I think that if these European specialists just pick their eyes up, glance across the Atlantic and see what's going on in the Caribbean, they will actually have further evidence to support their arguments about this as an unprecedented conflict. This perspective also does much for how we can think about the notion of counter-revolution itself and Britain's global role therein. There's been a great deal of work on British responses to and views of the French Revolution, but much has been focused on Europe. And my project seeks to widen the focus to Caribbean manifestations of counter-revolution, understanding how Britain acted as the main anti-republican pro-slavery force, and indeed seeks to do so by examining how those involved understood their role in the Caribbean, looking, in other words, at counter-revolutionary activity from the perspective of those actively involved on the ground. And this in turn feeds into wider work on the experience and representation of early modern war and violence, an area where histories of ideas and emotions have become increasingly significant. And indeed, what I'm trying to do is kind of, row in behind the likes of Erica Charters in the kind of globalization of this field, particularly by integrating the experience of irregular warfare and its colonial dimensions. Now, the British counter-insurgency in the revolutionary Caribbean has received relatively little attention so far. The works we have are either showing their age. I mean, these are great books, Creighton and Duffy. People will know Creighton perhaps more than Duffy's work, but these are both very important books. But they're also, these are decades old now. There are also some what we might think of as kind of drum and trumpet military histories, which again, these are a couple of very, very good books, but they do lack kind of that wider engagement with kind of the broad historiography and conceptual frameworks. Indeed, it's imperative, I think, not to focus solely on the British expedition to Saint-Domingue, but also to events in the Eastern Caribbean, which have received far less attention, despite the fact that 2/3 of all British forces are sent to the Eastern Caribbean, not Saint-Domingue. Indeed, Friedland's claim that every island is not Haiti applies as much to the British counter-insurgency as to the revolutionary insurgency in the Eastern Caribbean. And indeed, one thing that's been clear in doing work on this is just how the place of kind of atrocities, the dehumanization of enemies, the real kind of intensity of the fighting, and the deep racialization of warfare in this period is something that we need to understand, I think. Okay, so having sketched very briefly the kind of the wider historiographical framing of the project, let me just say something about the general characteristics that shape the nature of the British struggle across the Creole Archipelago. And I'll do so fairly rapidly because I think this will be perhaps more familiar to many people in the call. So the sort of factors that are shaping the British campaigning and counterinsurgency are, there are a number of them. The first, of course, is geographical proximity that facilitated intra-island mobility and commerce. It's less than 20 miles between St. Vincent and St. Lucia. Canoes, sloops are moving very, very easily up and down the chain of islands. And indeed, as Gunvar Simmerson and Rasmus Christiansen have shown, these small crafts were part of a universally present infrastructure that spread across and between the islands of the Creole Archipelago and shaped the kind of conflicts in this place. Secondly, the region was characterized by patterns of cultural interpenetration and multilingualism, reflecting longer histories of geopolitical struggle and shifting control. So, for example, we have French-speaking Catholic populations, many of mixed European African ancestry in the Ceded Islands, who faced social marginalization and political repression from the 1780s. With the onset of the French Revolution, they were subject to even more intensified discrimination, and suspicion from Anglophone colonists and the British authorities. And as a result, many were only too ready to support the revolutionary cause, as we see, for example, in Grenada with the insurrection named after Julien Ferrand. Third, the former French islands of the Lesser Antilles that had been ceded after the 7 Years' War were relatively underdeveloped in comparison with Saint-Domingue, certainly, and also Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados. And the final decades of the 18th century witnessed an inpouring of capital investment, settlers, many Scottish, as Doug Hamilton has talked about, and enslaved African labourers as part of an aggressive expansion of the plantation system. And this exacerbates social tensions, not least with existing populations like the Garifuna, who fought to maintain territorial presence and autonomy. Fourth, after war broke out between Britain and France, the arrival of large numbers of unseasoned soldiers from Europe undermines herd immunity, resulting in, of course, terrible outbreaks of disease. In consequence, while the military actions fought across the Creole Archipelago were small scale in comparison with what's happening in Europe, Caribbean operations could be far more costly than a dozen pitched battles. And the creation of this disease environment had other effects. It gave a particular rhythm to campaigning in the region, and also the heavy loss of life also made the region a very unpopular posting and created problems with maintaining morale. And I was having an interesting conversation with some of my students today about kind of sense of fatalism amongst the British troops. Coming back to what Marcia was saying, but before, of course, another consequence of this disease environment is the Africanization of European forces, which in the British case means the creation of the West India regiments. Fifth, the impact of the formal French abolition of slavery in 1794, which of course only codifies the forms of self-liberation and emancipation that were already happening in Saint-Domingue and elsewhere, radically alters the military balance in the region. It allows Victor Hugo, when he arrives in Guadeloupe with only a few hundred troops, to overwhelm the British by essentially aligning his cause with that of the local African descended population, and then go on to drive the British from St. Lucia, support the insurgencies in St. Vincent and Grenada, and attack the British elsewhere. All these factors then shaped the British struggle in and against the Creole Archipelago. They made the islands difficult to retain control over, and whilst it was sometimes easy to capture them, it was very hard to secure them, particularly in the face of insurgent populations and the support that could come and did come from elsewhere in the region. David Gagus talked about this as guerrilla warfare a decade before the term was coined. Bushfighting is one of the terms that's used. We see a series of asymmetrical conflicts fought over a contested frontier between plantation and non-plantation spaces, between the cultivated plain and the rugged, heavily wooded interiors of many islands, les bois. Okay, so to illustrate the sort of thing I'm talking about, I'm going to focus on a very specific part of the conflict in the Creole Archipelago, which are the latter stages of what the British termed the Brigand War in St. Lucia. David Barry Gasper dubbed this La Guerre des Bois, the War of the Woods. And particularly, I'm interested in this conflict as seen through the eyes of John Moore, the commander on the ground. So those of you, many of you will know, St. Lucia is a highly contested island, captured by the British in 1794, recaptured by the French the following year, and then captured again by the British in 1796, by which point an insurgency involving many self-liberating people of African descent have become a significant factor. And it's at this point that John Moore is left in charge when the rest of the British Expeditionary Force move on. And we have Moore's private journal, his letters to his family, his communications with his officer Abercrombie, along with a series of contemporaneous accounts, which are very revealing about how British military personnel experienced, understood, and represented this struggle in St. Lucia. Briefly, I'm not going to say much about Moore. That's not really my purpose here today. He's a career soldier from Scotland. He'd fought in the American Revolutionary War. One of the reasons why he's a fairly famous figure, he dies in the Peninsular War and is replaced by Wellington as the commander of the British Army there. But he's also fairly famous because he's seen as one of the key figures behind the establishment of so-called light infantry as used by the British. And this is often attributed to his time in the American Revolutionary War and his involvement in putting the Irish rebellion down in 1798. Staggeringly, his time in St. Lucia between the middle of 1796 and the middle of 1797 in fighting a counter-insurgency is usually ignored, which is one of the things I want to try and resolve in the wider project. With the rest of the British force moving on, then, Moore is left in command of around 5,000 troops, including several hundred soldiers of African descent in O'Meara's corps, as well as a number of Royal Navy frigates. But despite the resources he has to hand, Moore fears he lacks the strength to secure the island and prevent aid arriving from Guadeloupe. And as I'll briefly explain, his challenge is not only a military one, but also a political and indeed an emotional one. He's seeking to deal with a whole series of kind of complex tensions in St. Lucia. This, of course, is an image of Jamaica. And of course, it's not really an image of anywhere. It gives us a sense of how the British particularly understood what sort of was happening in the mid-1790s. And I think that speaks to the way in which very early on in this second period of British occupation, there's a dawning recognition that St. Lucia's geography made it ideal for an insurgency. Moore describes its interior parts as mountainous but covered with wood. The ground produces spontaneously with little culture a range of foods, including vegetables of the potato kind. He's talking about yams and cassava, as well as greens as delicate as spinach and callaloo. In St. Lucia, as in some other windward islands, produce cultivated on provision grounds, which of course was essential for the feeding of the enslaved population, were often many miles away from the plantations, which is not the same in other parts of the Caribbean. And enslaved people had been required to travel sometimes quite considerable distances to reach them from the estates. And of course, this then meant that we have the creation of a kind of interior, nutritionally rich interior space that's inaccessible to those who don't know the area, which favors those with local knowledge. In other words, something that's ideal for supporting insurgency against the British. Quickly, it also came to be understood that the British were facing highly motivated, skilled adversaries. When the French had surrendered to Abercrombie, over 2,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. And these captives, as well as some from Grenada and St. Vincent, would end up being shipped to England, where they were held at Porchester Castle in Hampshire. If colleagues don't know the work of Abigail Coppins, who did a PhD with us at Warwick, on the prisoners of war, then I would encourage you to check it out, because her analysis shows that most of these prisoners of war who end up being shipped out to Hampshire are of African descent. And this gives us a real sense of the nature of the French army in the Caribbean. This is primarily, overwhelmingly, an African descended force. And this was also the case of the insurgents in St. Lucia, made up of black regulars from across the region who had not been taken captive, fighting alongside agricultural workers who refused to be re-enslaved and had gone maroon. These insurgents were well adapted to the environment. Another officer in British service at the time described them as tireless, resourceful fighters who know every plant, every fish, every fruit, move silently and attack by surprise. The British called the enemies they fought in the interconnected insurgencies in St. Lucia, Grenada, and St. Vincent, brigands. And throughout history, it's been common for kind of irregular fighters to be labeled in derogatory, non-military ways as a way of seeking to deny them legitimacy. But this didn't make them any less effective fighters. And indeed, I think there's an interesting gap between how the British viewed the people they were fighting and how those people actually fought that partly confounded British expectations. So, an example. Early on in the recapture of St. Lucia, one Major Thomas MacDougall of the 53rd Foot describes a nighttime attack he'd been ordered by John Moore, his commanding officer, to attack some French forces. They charge at their enemies, but when they do so, their enemies stop, turn, the front rank kneels, and the two ranks behind them fire at them. In other words, they fight in the style of ordered European soldiers, and the British lose dozens of men, and although they're able to prevail overall and take many captures. But when the sun rises the next day, MacDougall surveys the field and expresses his mortification at not finding one white man amongst the prisoners or dead, mortified perhaps that he'd been so roughly handled by men he dismissed as mere brigands. Moore came to understand that the spirit of the insurgency in St. Lucia was driven by the determination of African-descended people to retain their freedom and equality. They were, he wrote, to a man attached to the French cause. Neither hanging, threats, or money would obtain any intelligence from them. He comes to have a begrudging respect for them, describing them as having many good qualities and admitting that the cause in which they fight is praiseworthy. And there's a kind of an interesting account he gives at one point. He wrote in his journal, "Their attachment and fidelity to the cause is great. They go to death with indifference. One man of the day denied and persevered in doing so that he'd ever been with them, the insurgents, or knew anything of them. The instant before he was shot, he called out, 'Vive la République.'" Now, Friedland would see this as evidence to support his argument that the rebels in St. Lucia and other Windward Islands saw themselves as part of the French Atlantic Revolution, which more cast in terms of the influence of vagabonds of the Robespierre faction. And while this is a typical example of the agitator myth, through which outsiders are blamed for stirring up discontent in otherwise uncontented populations, Moore's observation also points to the importance of outside connections to this local insurgency in St. Lucia. So, for instance, prior to the transportation of prisoners of war after the recapture of St. Lucia in May 1796, Moore spends time in company with some of the Republican leaders, including one Gorond, who he describes as a man much liked by the colony. And this is a man who'd come from Guadeloupe. Later on, he will meet one Jean-Louis Marin-Pedre, who was a free man of colour from St. Lucia, who'd gone to St. Vincent to fight there before coming back to St. Lucia. And after hearing of Marin-Pedre's surrender in St. Vincent, Moore sought to use him, bringing him to St. Lucia to serve as an intermediary as he sought to persuade the brigands, as he called them, to surrender, promising Marin-Pedre that he would restore his status as a planter if he was able to bring about peace. And as with Goron, Moore describes Marin-Pedre as a plain man with great goodness of heart. He assumes no air, though dressed in the national uniform with two epaulettes, he shakes hands and speaks kindly and familiarly with all. It turns out actually that Marin-Pedre is playing up both sides and is in fact helping the insurgents, even though he's promising to help Moore. But one of the points I want to make here is, and this is something that Moore does not reflect on, is that it's not hard to imagine how he, as British military governor in St. Lucia, fundamentally estranged from the mass of the local population and spearheading militarized efforts to restore white supremacism and racial slavery, would have been viewed in contrast with men such as Marin-Pedre and Goron. As he wrote to his father in one moment of clarity, their hatred to us and attachment to the republic which they think has given them liberty is great. In contrast with the insurgents, the British troops proved themselves ill-suited for irregular warfare in St. Lucia. I won't go into the details, but there's something about the particular nature of British forces in 1796-97 as against those in 1793-94 that basically mean Moore has not the right kind of men at hand. I can go into that if people really want me to, into the kind of weeds of military history, but it is interesting and quite important. Indeed, Moore faced severe challenges maintaining the morale of his own men. Disease, desertion, constant rumours of French reinforcements left his troops dispirited. Heavy losses led to the drafting of men from one shattered unit into another, whereas the normal practice would be that once a regiment got to a certain week, it became too weak, it would be sent home. But that doesn't happen. Instead, they just constantly keep shoving the men into new regiments. Other accounts describe a culture of really heavy drinking, and also a fatalistic acceptance around death. Naively, perhaps, Moore believed that maintaining his soldiers required constant drilling and movement, yet the officers under him failed to enforce this. Indeed, many rejoiced if they could simply purchase a commission that would allow them to escape West Indian service, prompting his scorn for men who only thought of getting home. And yet, at the same time, he confided to his own journal how vexed he was, seeing no prospect of his situation getting better. "I would give the world to quit my command or even get home," he wrote. Now, Moore's strategy emphasized offensive action. Fearing a repeat of 1795, when the French had brought forces in from Guadeloupe, working with local self-liberated people of African descent to drive the British back to Castres and Morne-Fortuné, he sought to disperse his troops to fortified posts across the island. Early on in Moore's governorship, St. Lucia's southern quarters were the focus of the insurgency. And this was an area with many small bays that made it accessible to nearby St. Vincent, where the British were also fighting an insurgency involving the Garifuna and their French allies. Patrols and raids targeted insurgent camps, often requiring grueling marches over treacherous terrain and unfamiliar terrain. British regulars burdened with heavy woolen uniforms and muskets described this harassing duty, and losses were catastrophic. For example, the 31st Regiment, after months of campaigning in St. Lucia, was sent home to Britain with an effective force of 85 men out of 1,000. Combat itself was brutal and unfamiliar. While his enemies excelled at sniping, Moore's forces relied on bayonet charges, producing bloody close-quarter fighting. Accidental musket charges spoiled attacks, suggesting inexperience and perhaps even a reluctance to fight this way. Moore demanded initiative from his officers, but found many wanting, and he described the people under his command as kind of frightened, not knowing what they're about. And there's a particular incident that gives you a sense of what Moore expected from his men, which was that in early 1797, Moore is off St. Lucia, he's in St. Vincent, consulting Abercrombie about what he should do. And a post on the Atlantic side of St. Lucia is overrun by brigands, as they would call them. The commanding officer is a French royalist, Captain de Marchais, who's obviously fighting alongside the British, and he's asleep at the time of the attack. And he becomes so enraged when his men flee that he lost his head and was incapable of giving orders. And realizing that a general retreat was the only possibility, he drew out his pistol and shot himself, something that Moore actually commended as a sign of de Marchais' strong sense of honor. And he was, that he could not survive the disgrace that he'd brought upon himself. Defeated by black insurgents who were viewed as illegitimate brigands, and having failed to control his own soldiers, who interestingly happened to be of African descent and formerly of enslaved, de Marchais' response to this shame and humiliation was suicide. And that's, again, is something that I've become quite interested in, is looking for those accounts where it's actually quite a number of times where British officers in British service kill themselves in this war. Believing he could not rely on his subordinates, Moore took to leading his troops personally, sharing their privations. And in these actions, he came to increasingly rely on the black troops under his command. And he writes very positively about such men. This is an image of St. Lucia Rangers from 1797. He describes them as having excellent qualities, who with proper attention could become equal to anything. And he believed that if he had enough of such men to hand, he would be able to scour the woods and defeat the insurgency. And indeed, it's primarily these soldiers of African descent that he's using, whilst his dwindling number of white troops remain largely confined to garrison duties. Moore also came to understand that the challenge he faced in St. Lucia wasn't just a military one, but also one of managing or attempting to manage a series of disruptive emotional forces. He sought to suppress factionalism amongst the returning royalist planters, urging them to remain quiet and attend only to their private affairs. He was concerned that the emigres who had come back with the British would turn their attention to avenge themselves against those they suspected of being Republican sympathizers. But despite his efforts to try and sort of heal divisions within the free population, ill-feeling persisted and slurs and accusations were rife. And this undermined Moore's efforts to neutralize Republican agents. So one of the things he's trying to do is work out who is still supporting the French Republican cause. But everyone's pointing fingers at each other and accusing one another. He's never quite sure who to trust. Restoring prosperity and welfare in St. Lucia, of course, meant re-establishing slavery and the plantation system, which was a daunting task, given the formal emancipation in 1794, and of course, years of armed insurgency. Moore urged the planters to treat their workers with kindness, arguing that men, having been told they were free, would not return easily to slavery. And again, something that I'm interested in the wider project is the kind of paternalistic vision that's often articulated by British officers, who, we've got to remember, this is sort of in the, this is 10 years or so after the formal emergence of an anti-slavery movement, and how these men understand that. The kind of, the extent to which they're viewing the conflict in the Caribbean through a pro or anti-slavery lens is a kind of something I want to get at. One of the things you see very often is how the military officers will often portray military discipline as almost an idealized version of what the relationship between the enslaver and the enslaved should be. Alongside coercion, Moore tried to pursue early on, at least, what we might think of as a kind of strategy of hearts and minds. But very rapidly, his campaign escalated towards much more scorched earth tactics, burning the habitations and destroying the provision grounds of those he fought against. Finally, Moore also came to understand the truly archipelagic nature of the insurgency, seeking to isolate St. Lucia and break its bonds with the rest of the Creole Archipelago. While the arrival of British forces in St. Vincent had ended the danger from that direction, he also sought to sever the links with Guadeloupe, fearing that arms and supplies would sustain the local resistance. But despite naval patrols and coastal posts, the numerous bays made interception difficult. Moore sought to destroy canoes and other vessels, executing captured crews, but admitted that the country is too extensive and too rugged to be effectively guarded. By the late summer of 1796, having killed 300 to 400 insurgents, he believed they were now wholly dependent on Guadeloupe. He wrote, "The brigands have been so driven and must be so much distressed with provisions that I am convinced that could all communication be intercepted for 3 weeks, the business would be over and tranquility restored to the island. But any succor from Guadeloupe will throw everything back." Later, he wrote, "The brigands have received lately some supplies of ammunition and provisions, and this has raised their spirits. I therefore do not think this the moment to negotiate. I first wish to give them what he called a drubbing." Such comments simultaneously reveal how Moore understood the interplay of the material and the moral, as well as the interconnected nature of the insurgency in St. Lucia. In the end, Moore's violent efforts took their toll on him personally, and he was sent home after a second serious bout of illness. Moore had worried that his efforts in St. Lucia would earn him little glory, and they did not. However, he did achieve it after being mortally wounded at the Battle of Corunna in 1809, a successful rearguard action early on in the Peninsular War, which is, and he's commemorated at St. Paul's Cathedral. And this monument is one of a number that the organisation SV2G, along with colleagues in our French department at Warwick, have been seeking to recontextualise. The inscription on the monument notes that Moore served in the West Indies, but gives no details about what this entailed, nor about what was involved in suppressing those who fought for their freedom. Some brief conclusions. In Moore's absence, his successor continued the scorched earth tactics in St. Lucia, and by the end of 1797, the insurgency was beginning to lose its momentum. The enslaved population had fallen from about 18,000 to about 13,000 over the course of the decade, due to the impacts of war, as well as a famine from 1796 to 1798 that was a product of British ecocidal actions. Moore had viewed the British counter-insurgency in St. Lucia as part of an all-encompassing struggle against the spirit and enterprise of the Republic that was manifest in the resistance his forces faced from brigands, agents, and leaders, both local and regional, and the succors they received from outside. In the face of this bewildering multi-ethnic coalition that was characterized by pan-Caribbean solidarities that the British found hard to fathom, the British struggled, and I mean they struggled. Nonetheless, they worked systematically and violently to break apart the Creole Archipelago, to isolate and neutralize its high community, and eventually to still the common wind. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. That was very rich, very interesting. I'm sure people will be thinking about either raising their hands or asking questions in the chat. So while they're doing so, I certainly have a number of issues I would like to raise, but I will just do one of them, which is your interesting description, of course, of the brigands. However fascinating they are, the language, the descriptions, all of it is so reminiscent of how people described Maroons across the Caribbean, in all parts of the Caribbean. It seemed the language seemed extremely similar, both the kind of disrespect and respect, both. So I think that, and also the kind of the nature of the interior that you described in St. Lucia. So I think that might be worth something, expanding upon a bit.
Yeah. So this is something that so some people in the chat will know, in the call will know, Angus Martin, who's historian from Grenada, has been at Warwick for the last recent years. We've had a number of events recently where we've been discussing some of these matters, and this is one of the things that we've actually been having to talk about. the way in which they talk about the brigands is very, as you rightly say, Gad, is very much how the Maroons are talked about, and not just the Maroons in general, but specifically the Maroons at this period, because of course at exactly the same time this is happening, we've got the Second Maroon War in Jamaica, and there's also there's unrest and insurgency going on in Dominica as well. And so one question that's been put to me, I think Tim Lockley, our colleague Tim, put to me is, well, why don't the British military use the term Maroon to describe the people they're fighting? And I think it's because Maroon just isn't a military category. Most of these people are coming to the region. They don't know the Caribbean. They don't know very much about the Caribbean. So I think they're just bringing there's another term they're bringing with them. Banditti is another one. So the idea that these are basically like robbers. And that of course ties in with that idea that these are illegitimate. Now, interestingly, the term brigand and the French equivalent of brigand is used by, so very early on in the insurrection in Saint-Domingue, the French start talking about the self-liberating enslaved people in the northern province as brigands. So they use that term. And the French also use that term to describe the people they're fighting in the Vendée. So those kind of like pro-royalist Catholic elements who the British back in Western France. So there's a kind of a wider story about brigandage going on here, which is something that I'm looking to trace in the projects I'm doing next year. Because obviously the term that we might use now, and the historiography talks about this, is guerrilla. But of course, they don't have that term available to them because that term hasn't been, that's from the Peninsular War. That's yet to happen. So banditti, brigand, maroon, the kind of relationship and how some of the way in which these terms are clearly, some of these are overlapping with one another. Some are specific to the Caribbean, others are not. This is where I mentioned right at the beginning that there's a history of ideas element to the project I'm trying to do, and that is precisely one of the things I want to explore, Gad.
Great. Well, that's very relevant to the Reed's question in the chat, which was counterinsurgency the term the British were using at the time? And further, just in relation to what you were just saying, can you say a bit about the intellectual history of the counterinsurgency doctrine? Where did it come from? How did it develop after? And yeah.
So, not counterinsurgency. Yes, insurgency and insurgent. So part of the term that they will use is often they'll talk about bushfighting. And that's again is a category that I'm interested in tracing, because the category of bush is that's both a general term but also a geographically specific one, because there's a lot of kind of traffic backwards and forwards between different kind of theatres of conflict and indeed earlier conflicts, Takis, 7 Years' War, how those things inform, the kind of that history of ideas is exactly one of the things I want to look at. When it comes to I don't think we can really talk about doctrine, because I don't think we're really there. And I think one of the things that's relevant to that, if I've got a copy of the book to hand, is Hugh Davies. So Hugh is a military historian at KCL. And he wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Wandering Army, which is basically about a kind of an intellectual history of the British Army, and including kind of ideas of the small wars that we associate with the later Victorian period. And one of the things that Hugh argues in that book is that the British basically keep forgetting the last set of lessons they'd learned from a previous war. So that idea of the development of a doctrine isn't really something that's happening because they're not really learning the lessons. And that includes they don't have the language to describe these things. And as a particular example of this, again, coming back to your question about counterinsurgency, is that really until the early 19th century, whenever the British are fighting what we might think of as la petite guerre, irregular war, whatever, they outsource that to other people. So I mentioned that Moore is credited to the person who plays a key role in the development of light infantry tactics. Usually what the British have done up to then is they'll just hire usually Germans. I mean, they're not really German, Italian, Swiss, Dutch, Jaegers, chasseurs. They'll basically use those types of people to do that kind of stuff for them. And those people are fighting in the Caribbean on the British side too. But then in the early 19th century, the British come to the conclusion they actually need to, in a sense, bring those things into house and start to develop that kind of approach. And I think the Caribbean is decisive in that story, or, you know, is at least one of the sites that's decisive in that story, as well as the conflicts taking place on the South African frontier against the Dutch and so forth. I think the Caribbean is a site that begins to answer precisely those questions that you've raised there. So thank you.
So I take this to be Joe Norcup, though it's not what it says, but if it is, can you say more about how you will be researching and utilizing environmental histories to tell about the ecocides and counterinsurgency, the role of the environments, land and maritime, inform the British military in their strategic tactics?
So there's two things, Joe, and it's a kind of a challenge because there are some tensions between the different strands of historical thought I'm trying to engage with. Because on the one hand, I am interested in let's call it the history of environmental ideas. So precisely the thing I've just been saying there about the idea of the bush as a category. What is bush? What are woods? Because those things might seem self-evident, but actually they're often carrying certain ideas, certain associations. That image I showed you from the Second Maroon War, the image of the ambush, that engraving, which will be familiar to people, that's an image that it's best to see that not an image of a real territory, but that's an image of an idea about a territory. You know, you're familiar with this, Joe. So on the one hand, I am interested in a history of environmental ideas and how that intersects with precisely the questions I was getting before about kind of, you know, counterinsurgency doctrine, But on the other hand, I am interested in thinking about the actual effects of environment. So that's one of the things I touched on, I didn't spend too long in the paper talking about it, but that idea of the particular patterns of provisioning which characterize St. Lucia and some of the other Windward Islands, which you don't see across them, that's not universal. That idea of having provision grounds up to 10 miles away from the estates, that does create a completely different type of opportunity. People aren't just running away into the wilderness. They're running away to places where they grow food. They're running away to places that might actually have not just social meaning, because of course we know that provision grounds were one of the places where enslaved people could express agency. You know, there's autonomy going on there. But these would often might have spiritual meaning. I'm thinking, you know, some of you will be aware of the work. It's quite a long time ago, and I remember that Mimi Sheller did on trees, and there's some of the significance there. So there's a kind of two things going on there that I'm trying to keep in tension, Joe. There's a kind of the actual impact of the environment and the ideas of environment in this thing. And I agree there is a tension between the two, but I want to try and keep the two of them blending at the same time because I think both are significant.
Very good. Very good. I mean, the provision ground story is a big story and really interesting across the Caribbean and very important. We could go on about that, but Kate has a question.
Oh, I have many questions. Thanks so much for such a fascinating talk. I guess just as you were speaking just now, I thought of a new question, another question, which is about the history of emotions and how you're using that. And, you know, I presume you do that through reading the soldiers' diaries, etc. But can you say how difficult has it been to sort of inhabit the emotional universe of the 18th century, you know, reading it back through a 21st century lens? How are we able to inhabit, you're saying, you know, what does a tree mean? What does a bush mean in different contexts? But how do we know, how do we interpret their emotional world? And then just a specific one about, I mean, obviously it's fascinating that this John Moore is in wars here, there and everywhere in the US, in Ireland, St. Lucia, and then in the Peninsular War. Trying to reach back into the depths of my memory on Irish history, but would he have encountered irregular tactics, sort of guerrilla tactics in the Irish Rebellion of 1798 that he was putting down? And if I could squeeze in one last, because it was just so, you introduced it and left it hanging, partly because it's not to do with your paper, but I really need to know what happened to those prisoners of war that were held in that castle in Hampshire afterwards. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kate. Let me start with the first one. Just in case is Abby here or Kate? If Kate Asprey or Abby Coppins are in the thing, I happily to allow them to speak for themselves. If they're not, I'm happy to speak on their behalf. But no. So basically, I'll put something in the chat in a moment. But so yeah, hundreds of, well, thousands of prisoners of war transported to Portchester. You can still go and visit the site. It's an English heritage site. Abby estimates that it's probably the largest concentration of African descended people in Britain at that point. You know, I guess how you think about different port cities and stuff, but there are lots of them there. Generally, with prisoners of war, officers are allowed to do parole, you know, like go and give their promise they're going to, you know, act well and then just be put up in someone's house or in a boarding lodge. They don't do that with the black officers. The black officers, by the way, include, I mean, some of you may know this names, like Louis Delgrès is one of these people. Pelage, I mean, you know, Maranier, Marin Pedro. These are some really like significant people who will, and a lot of the people will end like. Usually what happens with officers is they'll exchange them, and the same with soldiers, they'll exchange them for other prisoners. Some of them end up going then back to the Caribbean again to continue the fight. Some of the ordinary soldiers, I mean, and they're treated really badly. I mean, they're treated as prisoners of war, let's be clear, but they are suffering in like winter in Hampshire in a castle. And also on prison barges and stuff. And Abby's written all about this, and there's a thesis about this where, you know, the conditions are pretty terrible they're kept in. I think she said, I think I've come across some of them end up in the Russian campaign. Some of these poor souls end up marching to Moscow later on. Others end up in all sorts of places. And actually their treatment in metropolitan France isn't necessarily great, which raises some interesting questions about Paul Friedland's arguments about the kind of, they might have saw themselves as fighting for a universal French Revolution. That doesn't mean it was the feeling was mutual, which I think is an interesting point. So that's them. United Irishman Rebellion, yes, absolutely. I mean, more. I'm not an expert on Irish history, but the reading I've done more seems to have this reputation of being one of the more humane British officers, but whatever that means. But yes, he does face those kind of tactics. And that, as I said, Kate, that's one of the things that said, well, he learned from that and therefore realized that the British Army needed to be able to fight in irregular forces. So they had to be able to skirmish and operate in loose formations and all that stuff. And he did a bit of that in Ireland, but he did it for months more of it in St. Lucia. So there's also a weird thing about why Ireland rather than not St. Lucia. And it's clearly both. And I think that there's an interesting story, which is not really my focus, but thinking about the extent to which his views of what's happening in the United Irishman Rebellion in Ireland, how that's shaped by his views about what happened in St. Lucia. That is an interesting question, because it's many of the same British soldiers and sailors go from the Caribbean to Ireland next, and then they go on to Egypt. So there's a story here, and prior to that, many of them are in Corsica, which is briefly occupied by the British, and they're kind of, so there's actually a kind of archipelagic, a broader archipelagic story here about the British experience, which kind of goes back to old work I did on imperial careering. I think these people fit that model perfectly. History of emotions. So I'm not a history of emotions. I don't come from that as my background. It's something I've been reading and getting into. And I find some of the work in history of emotions interesting, and there are things I can do with it. There are certain, I'm not particularly interested in trying to just unpack exactly how everybody feels. I don't think the sources aren't rich enough to do that, even if was one able to do that. But I think for me is more interesting is more almost like a history of the emotions, the idea of emotions, which is again a bit like the way I'm thinking about the environment. So there are certain concepts, spirit, ideas about zeal, ideas about honor and shame, which I think is a bit easier to kind of get at and understand the world in which they're coming from. And I came across a reference just recently, which I got quite excited about, which is, I mean, ultimately, when you're trying to unpack a history of emotions, you want to understand, you know, emotions aren't just something that they're cultural scripts. They're not just like, I mean, that's an argument in that field. I would go more with the culturalist approach, that they are kind of a cultural script that's partly informed by, in the late 18th century, ideas of sentiment, ideas of rationality, maybe, the kind of the idea of the romantic, these sorts of things would be how I would start to think about emotional repertoires. And one of the things I was able to find out just a few days ago and do some reading was apparently there's a particular set of books by a particular author who's pretty much forgotten now, who all the military soldiers are reading. And it's a kind of classic sentimental novel. It's almost like a precursor to Jane Austen's writing. And part of me is wondering whether I should start reading those sentimental novels, to kind of get a sense of, like, why would all these British officers on campaign be reading these stories? And are there any clues there for how they're thinking about what they're doing? Or is it just how they're thinking about loss, and that, they're not spending their time with their sweethearts, whatever, something like that. So that's you don't normally get things like that where someone says, yeah, we were all reading these books. So that's the sort of thing you might get a little way in, but it is a hard area. And I think one of the challenges with the history of emotions as a general field is it's very much, it seems to me, being developed in source-rich historical contexts, which don't necessarily work quite so well in resource-poor emotional contexts, and I think that is a challenge with the field. I hope that begins to answer your question, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's all fascinating.
Steve, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much. I was interested in your picture of the Sir John Moore Memorial in St Paul's Cathedral.
Yeah.
And the attempt to recontextualize it, because it reminded me of, when I was 14, English literature, we learnt the poem about the burial of St John Moore at Corunna, and we all laughed about the line, the sods with their bayonets turning, and so on. But I just sort of think how he has become this kind of national hero. The Wetherspoons pub in Glasgow is called the Sir John Moore, and so on. And I was just thinking about those monuments in St Paul's Cathedral. There's one there for Admiral Codrington, the man who won the Battle of Navarino, and when there were suggestions that they might put on, that someone might put there, that he made thousands of pounds out of slavery compensation because he owned part of the Codrington plantation back in the Caribbean. There was kind of outrage. So I don't know if you want to say any more about that. I'd certainly be interested in talking to these people of yours who are doing this.
One of them's here. Jacqueline Roberts. I presume it's that. Jacqueline, that's you, I presume. I don't want to call you because you might be doing something else, but so she's one of the trustees of an organisation called SV2G, St Vincent and the Grenadines, second generation, and they're an organisation who work, who are of the diasporas of those islands, working very closely with people from their countries of origin. And they've done some work with Kate Aspie, a colleague in French, and Abigail Coppins. I think, did I see, is Christy in the chat as well? Christy Warren, I think, that I see her name before anyway, who's also done some work with them. And essentially, they did some work with St Paul's Cathedral, which I think they'd be better to tell you about than me. Where essentially what they did do, was essentially research these histories and take those, there's just passing references to West Indies, and just say, okay, what does that mean? And what they did very powerfully is they, Jackie and some of the people she works with, some of the group, essentially recorded audio that sort of talks about, you can be standing there in front of a statue of, Picton. Thomas Picton's there, some proper villains, and you're hearing a story about that makes you think of Picton in an entirely different way. And I think personally speaking, I thought that was a really good way of kind of intervening in, because St Paul's Cathedral aren't going to let you start moving things around and stuff like that. But very, very effective way. I hope the trail is still there. If it is, I'd strongly recommend it. Again, in a minute, when I got a chance, I'll try and put both that and the link to Portchester Castle in the chat. Yeah, I think they're doing a great job, and I think it does make you think differently about these stories. You know, and it is worth saying, come back to Kate's point, Steve, that this kind of mania almost for establishing all these statues in St. Paul's, you know, that's very specific to this period. And it's part, you know, whether it's I'm trying to think of some of the other people there. I mean, there's a bunch of them. It's the guys involved in the capture of Martinique, Captain, some Royal Navy guy. The fact that there is a kind of a very deliberate commemorative moment at the end of the 18th century, which comes back to Kate's point, I think, about the history of emotions and a kind of collective state-sponsored effort to memorialize a certain vision of heroism in the face of what was understood as this kind of almost existential conflict with it's not just a conflict with France, it's a conflict with republicanism. And I think that's one of the reasons why it takes on this, from the British and indeed the French perspective, intensified emotional, moment. I mean, that some of you will know that there's a British officer who's buried at Guadeloupe after they capture it. And when Victor Hugo recaptures it, one of the things they do is dig the guy up, the body of the British commander, and they, what's his phrase? He says basically, we let it be prey to the birds of the air. So they basically just stick his corpse out and let birds eat it. And that's one of the things that solidifies Victor Hugue's reputation as the uber villain in this story. But it also, I think, speaks very directly to a kind of contested commemorative politics, which was happening then and continues to this day with all the debates about national heroes and lack of, and, you know, these kind of stories. So I think there's a really interesting longue durée history of conflicts around who's remembered and how. I think more, particularly when you're in the face of people like Picton, Moore comes across as one of them. I mean, he's a career military soldier. He's a soldier, you know, for good and bad of what that means.
Very interesting. I think we have a final question from Kurt. Do you want to ask your question? Or have we lost him?
Perhaps just muted.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. See if I can switch off my speaker.
Yeah,
here.
you're there. Mm-hmm.
It's echoing.
Yeah.
My question is, I lived in St. Lucia for a while, and on Montfortune there are monuments for the British who fought there. And one of the monuments is for the Inniskillen regiment, which I think is Irish. And now you just told me that the regiments from St. Lucia were moved to Ireland to fight insurrection there.
Yep.
That's one question. Is this correct? That the Irish were sent back to Ireland to fight the Irish? And the other thing is, when I lived there, and until now I'm still in contact with people who live there, I saw very little attention to the insurrection, and especially the part played by African Caribbean people. And that's something which living in St. Lucia for a number of years, there were the monuments are still the leftovers of the British presence, and very little about those who fought for there as slave descendants. I don't know if your research showed anything there. I've also a lot of things I want to bring up about the history of emotions, but that's for another time. Thank you.
So just so we're clear, sorry, because the echo made it slightly difficult. Was the second question about why isn't this story better known in the Caribbean? Was that point? I couldn't quite follow that part.
Oh, he's muted. You're muted, Gert.
Okay. Can you repeat that, because my speaker was still off?
Okay. Your second part of your question, were you asking about why the the role of these insurgents isn't commemorated in the region. Was that your question? I didn't quite catch that.
Correct.
Okay. I mean, I think that's changing. I mean, I think obviously in St. Vincent there is a monument to Chateaubriand. In St. Lucia, there have been efforts. There's a particular woman, Flore Gaia de Bois, I think, who is important in the recapture of the island from the British the first time. And I've seen there's like her. I mean, we don't know very much about her, but she's become a kind of, it's almost like a proto-national hero. I don't think she's been formalized as a national hero in St. Lucia. But obviously, a lot of these islands look to what the Jamaicans did in the past, or the Bajans did with, Bussa or Nani and things like that. So there's a kind of like path for like doing that kind of thing. I know in the case of Grenada, talking to Angus last few weeks, there is a kind of slight thing around Julien Fedon, because he's a Jean de Color. He's a man of mixed European African ancestry, and his commitment to abolition or to emancipation isn't necessarily clear. He's really more about replacing the British with the French. So there's a question about whether that's really, does that perfectly fit the vision of a national hero rather than a person who is undoubtedly opposed to slavery. So that's one of the challenges with it. Some of these are quite complicated figures, because I think one of the reasons why the events in the 1790s, one of the reasons why the Haitian Revolution has dominated, Kurt, in comparison to the events in the Eastern Caribbean, is because the events in the Eastern Caribbean are also complicated. I mean, obviously, the Haitian Revolution is complicated, but often, as you'll know, it's been viewed as it was a large revolt by enslaved people that ends with slavery being abolished. And of course, it is partly that, but it's also a load of other things too. But there's a very easy story that says, Toussaint Louverture led an insurrection against slavery and eventually they ended it. Obviously, it's not that. It's more complicated than that. And likewise, the Anglo-Garifuna War, Fedon's Rebellion, La Guerre des Bois, the Brigands' War in St. Lucia, these are all quite complicated things where, there are heroes and villains, but they don't necessarily line up with how we might want them to do from a contemporary perspective, which probably makes commemorative practice more difficult if you're looking for simple stories like Nani or Bussa or something like that. I think that's part of the answer. The Enniskillens are, they're the answer. The best way to do that, because I promise you, I'm not a military historian. If you go to the website of the National Army Museum, nam.ac.uk, you'll get stuff on the Enniskillen Regiment. I mean, if I remember rightly, it's a pretty old one, 17th century. They're raised by, there are all sorts of regiments that raised in Ireland, and because Ireland is a complicated place. We're talking Ulster as much as Munster, so there are, of course, different groups of Irish who might have different relationships with the British state. I don't know whether the Enniskillen Regiment is one of the ones that gets sent to Ireland in that period. I couldn't tell you. I just genuinely don't know enough about that. And if they didn't, it wouldn't necessarily because they were worried about using the Irish against the Irish, because one of the things that soldiers often do is fight civilians. I mean, sometimes we seem surprised why would English yeomanry, why would the British yeomanry attack British people? Well, they do at Peterloo. Soldiers often do that, or irregular forces. They often suppress civilian populations. I mean, that's not uncommon. So it shouldn't be that surprising if Irish regiments were in Ireland putting down the United Irishmen's Rebellion. That wouldn't surprise me. But I genuinely don't know around that specific regiment.
Hey, very good. So we're coming to the end of our time. I'm going to ask you. I'm going to combine the question in the chat, which is, do we know how many? And then I'm going to ask Marcia to answer, so you perhaps answer both of these points. How many soldiers of African descent fighting on behalf of the British change sides and go over the brigands? That's one question. And Marcia will say the final question.
Okay.
if she unmutes herself.
Hi, hi. My response to you, David. Your presentation was extremely interesting. But what hit me very hard is that in relying on the information of John Moore and people of that caliber of the time, there's a continuance of sanitizing the British Army and Navy as it relates to the genocide of indigenous people and the murder of people of African descent. And I urge you to, hopefully I will see that addressed in what you are researching and preparing, because even studying and I welcomed the information in your book. I think I must have been the first person in Barbados to own one. As soon as it came out, I had it. I obviously understood clearly the focus with regards to the presentation of images of men, Black men fighting for England. However, I still feel that there's an avoidance in the literature and even in addressing the information from John Moore of what were the deep implications for Black men within these units, whether the men were sourced in Africa or prisoners of war who then could also have switched sides from being captured in one area to fighting for England eventually. It seems to me an unexplored area and an area that really needs to bring the British Army and Navy into the entire discussion that is presently going on accountability for the murders of millions of people of African descent. And this angle of prisoners of war being in Hampshire is also very important information for us here in the Caribbean. And I think if you, David, and other academics can bring this information into Barbados and St. Lucia, it will it should move the countries to answer courts, I think I'm saying his name correctly, input that there's no, there's no honoring of these people on the island. Here in Barbados, there's a very sanitized version of the British West Indies Regiment's role for England and the treatment of the men in those regiments from the period of the late 1700s right into the period when they started to disband these units or reduce them, which seems to have occurred from around 1811 onwards. So I just wanted to say, to input that. Again, I've heard almost a sanitized version today.
I talked about ecocide, Marcia. I mentioned 5,000 enslaved people, the population dropping. I talked about the destruction of provision grounds. I mean, I'm not going to spend I'd hope, I mean, that's not really what the paper was about, but I didn't, I wasn't talking about the glorious British military campaign in the Caribbean or anything like that. I think the tone was one of the destruction, the violence, but also, of course, the resistance that Moore and others were facing. I mean, when it comes to the experience of people of African descent on all sides, and of course they were on all sides, it is true that we don't know the conditions in which the men, the men of O'Meara's corps, who then eventually will become one of the West India regiments we're facing. As I said in the book that in Soldiers of Uncertain Rank, the only thing we can do is judge them by their actions. And they do mutiny, but they only mutiny 3 times. And they mutiny, I mean, the first mutiny in Dominica is when they are threatened, when their status as soldiers is threatened, when they're essentially, they believe they're going to be reduced to the status of enslaved field hands. That's when they mutiny. And I think, I mean, it's interesting about the kind of the status of the West India regiments, because I think, you know, thinking all the way back to Hilary Beckel's account of the Bussa Rebellion, as well as some of the stuff that happened around the 150th anniversary of Morant Bay, the way in which the men of the West India regiments was often talked about was that they were dupes, and that they were on the wrong side of history, and that they should have crossed sides and joined the people. You know, they should have joined the rebels at Morant Bay. They should have joined the insurgents in Barbados, but they don't. And soldiers don't normally. I mean, soldiers normally, most of the time, soldiers do their duty, and unfortunately, their duty is violence. And and of course, that violence is achieved because they're drilled and threatened, but also paid. And there is a combination. I mean, there's some, you'll know from the book, there is some really good kind of wider literature on particularly the relationship between slavery and soldiering, about the idea of military labor, which we don't tend to think about as soldiers as a form of labor, and labor historians tend to ignore it. And people will do horrible things usually through a combination of fear and threat, but also a sense of what they can gain from it for themselves, perhaps for their immediate people around them, for their comrades, for their families. And I think these are difficult, complicated stories. But I don't know. I mean, I think you're right that the kind of way in which the history of the West India regiments in general, in Barbados and elsewhere, has been portrayed is either a combination of them just being essentially they're the sanitized forerunners of the Barbados Defence Force or the Jamaica Defence Force or whatever, or else they're seen as these kind of dupes who they were on the wrong side of history. And I think there is a more complicated story about the regiments and at different times and about in different circumstances, not least about, for example, their role in West Africa, when you have people from Barbados or people from Jamaica who are involved in the defence and the expansion of the British Empire in that part of the world. It comes back to Kurt's question, I guess, about the Irish fighting the Irish. That's kind of what soldiers often do out of a combination of fear and favour. As I say, I don't think I would never ever seek to downplay the violence of this story. That's not the goal at all. I guess what I'm trying to do is to integrate a kind of understanding of that violence as a kind of trying to integrate the history of the British military in its Caribbean dimensions, because often if you read histories of the British military, the Caribbean doesn't even feature there, and then simultaneously place within the history of the Caribbean the history of the British military. And if that then does help, in some of the kind of institutional work that you were talking about, Marcia, about responsibility and reparation, by essentially positioning the Royal Navy and the British Army as institutions that were actively participating in the particular histories of the region that where you are now, then so much the better.
Yeah. I think that's a very good summary. I think we're going to conclude there, but it's a very interesting way to end it because there's a lot more to be said on that subject. Much more to be said. Sorry, my fault. Reed, if you look at the chat for a second, you'll see a comment from Jacqueline Roberts. Let me just turn, but let me say before this phone goes again that it was a great session and much appreciated. And I think everybody on the call and the depth of the questions speaks to the richness of this topic and the interesting research that you're doing. So obviously well done and very good. And I should say, I suppose, that our next seminar is a while away. It's the 6th of May, and it's Dr. Grace Carrington. I'm not sure if Kate has the exact title, but please look on the website if you're interested. And I hope you will join us. Yeah.
We don't yet have a title, and just to say, in the chat, Silu Pasco, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, wants their question about whether anyone changed sides answered. So either that was done.
Apologies, Silu. Sorry for not picking that up. My apologies to you. I've not come across evidence, but there is plenty of evidence of white European soldiers deserting to all sorts of crossing lines, and if that's taking place, I would be staggered if there isn't also desertion taking place of those precisely the people you mentioned. But I couldn't give you numbers or anything like that. I'm afraid I just don't have there isn't the historical data there. But yeah, I'm sure it's occurring as a phenomenon.
Great. Well, thanks again.